coming to you from the Northwoods of Minnesota for this Blue Marble evaluation webinar on systems mapping. I'm going to set the context for it. There are three ways in which system mapping is especially relevant for Blue Marble evaluation. The first of which is evaluating global networks themselves. A great deal of the work that goes on. I'm going to ask people to mute. We're hearing some background noise. So if you would mute your computers, that will help. We get some feedback if it's not muted. So three ways the system mapping is relevant to Blue Marble evaluation. The first is evaluating global networks. So for example, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food is an alliance of 23 major philanthropic foundations that are connected to each other, but connected to their own grantees and connected to a number of other alliances like the Agroecology Network and various climate change networks. There's Sustainable Development Goal networks. Indeed, the global landscape is filled with all kinds of networks. And one major focus of Blue Marble evaluation is tracking those networks, mapping them, seeing how they change, providing feedback about their strength, and in particular, how they may be connected to each other. So that's a focus for Blue Marble evaluation. A second area of relevance is building a Blue Marble evaluation network, which Glenn has been leading with Charmaine and others to create a way for Blue Marble evaluators to connect and interact. And the third way in which system mapping is relevant is in a theory of transformation for global systems change. Networks, given their importance globally, as indicated in the first item, makes the connections among networks a major focus of a theory of transformation. Steve Waddell did a major book on global action networks. There's a cumulative body of research and knowledge that points to interlocking networks as a pathway to transformation in complex dynamic systems. Next Monday on Earth Day, we will be having a Blue Marble webinar on the theory of transformation that will look at the role of global networks as a focus for a Blue Marble theory of transformation. The Stanford Social Innovation Review recently had a major article by Henry Mintzberg, Georeferencing, and Saku Manter on a worldly strategy for the global climate, in which they looked at the relationships between the public sector, the private sector, and the non-governmental sector, and the ways in which those sectors can network together either for positive virtuous circles or negative vicious circles. So the idea of networking operates at multiple levels. I thought, by way of setting the context for Christine and the presentation today, we might look at the latest result of the major network that's hit the news. Last week, the black hole photo was taken, and that was a result of a network. That photo, which has instantaneously become iconic, the first photo of a black hole, required an extraordinary network of researchers and radio telescopes around the world. No single radio telescope or set of them could have accomplished this. Creating that first ever portrait of a black hole was tricky. Black holes take up a minuscule sliver of sky and from Earth appear very faint. The project of imaging M87's black hole required observatories across the globe working in tandem as one virtual Earth-sized radio dish with sharper vision than any single observatory could achieve on its own. And so these radio telescopes around the world were able to network together, combine their capacities to create that work. It involved over 200 plus researchers coordinating this work. In order to braid together the observations from each observatory, researchers needed to record times for their data with exquisite precision. For that, they used hydrogen maser atomic clocks, which lose about 1 second every 100 million years. They recorded data at a rate of 64 gigabytes per second, which is about 1,000 times faster than a home internet connection. Those data were then transferred to the MIT Haystack Observatory and the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn, Germany, for processing in a special kind of supercomputer called a correlator. But each telescope station amassed hundreds of terabytes of information during a single observing campaign, far too much to send over the internet. So the researchers used the next best option, snail mail. So far, there have been no major shipping mishaps, but the leader of the project admitted that mailing the disk was always a bit nerve-wracking. Though most of the HT data reached Haystack and Max Planck within weeks of the 2017 observing campaign, there were no flights from the South Pole until November. He says we didn't get the data back from the South Pole until mid-December. And so that's an extraordinary example of a global network of radio astronomers, not only a global network of people, but of the radio telescopes themselves. We'll have another webinar on Earth Day on the theory of transformation and look at networks through that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine, who is here in Minnesota, a systems mapping specialist. She'll introduce herself and her colleagues. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that she can share hers. And take it away, Christine.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful framing and introduction. I'm actually not going to share my screen because I'm just going to talk. So,
all right.
But let me just get my comments figured. Wait, I just had a little technical weirdness all of a sudden, which is how things always tend to work with technology. Okay.
We are seeing you.
You are, yeah, good. So I'm getting there. Sorry. So I just want to say I'm really excited to be here with you today, along with one of my primary thought partners, Sarah Shanahan, who has, along with a handful of others, been exploring and helping to develop an emerging practice for mapping that we call social system mapping. So it's a real honor to be invited to be here with you to be sharing what we're learning. And I want to just thank you all for showing up. So the story of social system mapping, as Sarah and I and others currently define and practice it, started about 5 years ago with a data gathering tool. That tool, called sumApp, grew out of several frustrations that I was experiencing. So at that time, my business partner and spouse, Tim Hansen, and I had been doing various data gathering and data visualization projects in the emerging sort of network weaving, social lab, self-organizing system space. And in that space, we did a few projects creating network maps. And I had this sense that just given our values and our interests and our particular shared skill set, that mapping intentional and change networks would become the core focus of our work. But I wasn't happy with the tools that were available at that time. They were generally made for scientists and not members of loosely bounded networks, and they were better suited to an organizational context and to organizational purposes. And networks just didn't fit the mold that these tools were designed for, and we were having a hard time getting them to meet our clients' needs. So at about that time, Kumu became available. Kumu is an online interactive graph visualization tool, which I instantly fell in love with. And actually, Sarah, I forgot to ask you this, but I was thinking maybe you could, if you could, chat out a link to Kumu for the group now, so that they can just, if they want to, they can pop it open and see what Kumu looks like. Anyway, Kumu quickly became the visualization platform that we use with all of our clients. And most of our sumApp customers also use it for housing their social system maps. So you'll see an example of how Kumu can be used when Sarah shares her network's social system map with you in a few minutes. So Kumu solved the initial problem that I had with the available tools, but that still left the problem of data gathering. And the kind of mapping that I was interested in doing was less about answering any particular research question and more about helping members of change networks gain deeper insights into their networks so that they could be more effective. So part of that was helping them to see themselves as systems, where if you understand that the system is a specific boundary, a set of diverse perspectives, and interrelationships, well, that's also what a network is. So we wanted to help increase network members' ability to think systemically within the context of the systems that they're already embedded in, and in the context of the specific systems that they were trying to transform. So I won't go into all the shortcomings of the data gathering tools that existed at that time, but let's just say that we realized that if we were serious about the kind of mapping that we wanted to do, we'd have to build our own data gathering tool. So that's what we did. And it started out mostly intuitively, being really just about how do we get this data. The question for me was, so if most of what keeps a system the way it is hidden beneath the surface, and like as in that iceberg diagram that you've probably all seen, and if most of what's hidden beneath the surface is, at least with human systems, in the hearts and minds of individual human beings, then from a technical perspective, how can you get at that information? And how can you get at it in ways that make it visible and discussable, and that reflects the real stuff of the real people involved, and that also reflects the different perspectives of the real people involved, and that also reflects a whole lot of those people. So that was one piece of it. The other question that I was trying to solve for was, if, as so many systems thinkers suggest, the crucial mental shift necessary for systems thinking and for systemic transformation is a shift from focusing on entities to focusing on relationships, then which relationships are important for a change network to focus on, and how do we discover and represent, and most of all, highlight those relationships? But to be honest, mostly those questions were inarticulate and explicit, just based on my own ways of thinking. So it was less like an orderly, planned out research project and more of a personal learning journey, guided by just some gut level reactions to design decisions that I had to make while we were developing our tool. But ultimately, we discovered that those gut level design decisions that went into sumApp ended up unintentionally generating the possibility of a new kind of map. And as we've seen how that map it has emerged and is different from other kinds of mapping, we've started to call it social system mapping. So social system mapping is a mashup of a social network analysis map, a system map, value maps, asset maps, stakeholder maps, but with a whole lot more data points than you'd usually have in any of those kinds of maps. So saying it that way just makes it sound like it could be a chaotic, random mashup of just about anything. But we're learning that there are inherent, while these maps can be far more complex than we're used to, there's still some sort of inherent core principles that hold them together. So those principles are, we center our data on human beings and on their own self-reporting. So we get as much data as possible from the people in the networks themselves. And the kinds of data that we gather are defined, again, as much as possible by the network members themselves. We're attempting to connect the interpersonal relationship patterns to the systemic forces that help to shape them, which is different from with a classic social network analysis, where we tend to look at the patterns in isolation from the outside forces. we're also intentionally trying to personalize the systemic forces at play. Unlike with a classic system map, where if human beings exist at all, they're pretty much they're just pretty much collective abstractions in that map. Whereas here, we want to actually see who is connected to or impacted by those systemic forces and how they're connected or impacted. And we expect and support our maps to evolve over time in terms of content and participants, in terms of being able to define timeframes for your data points, enabling you to see how it changes over time, and most importantly, in terms of how the network understands and engages the map. So sumApp was explicitly designed to allow for flux, emergence, reiteration, discovery, and multidimensionality. The maps also have to be online so that they're always available, and interactive so that everyone in the network can do their own discovery with the map and satisfy their own curiosity. So through all of this, we're coming to see that the social system mapping process in and of itself is a learning journey for everyone involved. And part of what is being learned with all of the various kinds of maps that can be made in Kumu and other tools like it is a new visual language. And it's similar to the visual language of a geographical map in that we can represent a ton of data incorporating multiple dimensions in a visual language that once we know how to read it, we can almost instantly understand what that ton of data is telling us. It's a language that makes it possible to see things that otherwise remain hidden below the surface and to communicate quickly and more easily with one another about what's being revealed. And then I've just begun to recently articulate this in my own mind, just based on observing all the various maps I've worked with over time, that there's also something like developmental stages of interest and understanding and meaning making that people go through in relation to a social system map. So it's sort of like most people's understanding of a social system map starts at the center of a series of concentric circles and then gradually moves out from there. So it starts with, where am I? And does this represent me acceptably? And then it goes to, who else is here? And are they okay with how they're being represented? And then it goes out to, are my relationships being represented in a way that I'm comfortable with? And then it goes to, what about the other relationships in this network? Who here is connected to who and to what? And then if the process has been handled well and has continued long enough, people start to look at what's missing, what's needed, and what do we have too much of, and how can we address those patterns? And then ultimately, in an ideal world, or in my fantasy land maybe, they start to think about what is this whole that has the potential to emerge through us? What is this system that we're generating, and how can we nurture it? So through all of that, the more participatory the development and the design, the sense making and the reiteration process is, the more meaningful and valuable the map can become. The meaning and the personality of a map emerges over time through the interactions of its members. So it both supports and reflects the learning journey the group goes through as it enters into this new language and this new way of thinking together. So obviously the process used by a network sponsor in creating and engaging a map completely determines how it turns out. And frankly, we're all still learning how to design and implement this process in a way that really moves a group into its greater potential. Because like I said, my focus all along has been on how do we gather the data? And I've needed other people to sort of step in and start to think about, and how do we generate processes that help people make use of these maps? And so that's why I so appreciate Sarah Shanahan, who is going to share her map with you in just a moment, because she has been one of the most sophisticated and thoughtful and innovative map sponsors that I've ever worked with so far. And it's been an honor to be working with her and to get to do things like this webinar with her. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over, Sarah, to you.
Well, thank you, Christine, for such a generous introduction. It's really been a pleasure working with you. Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Ann Shanahan. I am the Director of Community Management for the REAMP Network. A little background about REAMP. The REAMP network sets collective strategy and enables climate solutions so that we can equitably decarbonize the Midwest. We have 8 states. We have over 130 nonprofit member organizations, and that includes philanthropic and advocacy organizations. What's unique about our network is our approach, and that's really reflected in our motto, which is to think systemically and act collaboratively. And that's really important because we believe that by taking the strategy of thinking systemically with the power of collaborating with organizations that know their communities best, we can make impactful change. And I really wanted to highlight that because, you know, this idea of thinking systemically is really the heart and soul of our REAMP network. Our work is actually grounded in a collaboratively created shared systems analysis called equitable deep decarbonization. And that framework has transformed the way that organizations in the Midwest are making a difference on climate. And it's that background and it's that grounding from my network perspective that really led me to start thinking about, you know, how might we apply that practice to our network? And that's really what led me to Christine. You know, when I think about a network of people, it is humans, right? They're individuals, they're people in the network, and that makes it really, really complex. We had an analysis done by Pete Plastrick a few years ago and found that it takes on average our members 2 years to really understand the power of the network. So, you know, how can we take this practice of thinking systemically and really take it to the network and really taking it to understand not only like where people are showing up and their participation, but as Christine said, there's a lot of these other really rich dynamics that are underlying the relationships that we build between people. That's actually one of the most important functions of the network. And it's also one of the pieces of the story that's hardest for us to tell and hardest for us to show. So with that said, I think I'm going to do a little screen share here. Give me just a second. So as Christine was saying, you know, our journey to developing a social systems map for ourselves, we're really just thinking about like all of those dynamics and layering all that information together. And I want to start off too by saying that we're very much in our early stages of developing our map, but we do have some very high aspirations for it. You know, a lot of what Christine talked about is what we want to see in our map too. You know, we're really interested in, you know, the social network analysis piece. We're interested in the systems map, you know, thinking about our equitable deep decarbonization framework and how we can incorporate that into here. We have some assets maps. We're looking at resource flow diagrams. We also want to include ripple effect mapping as all part of this social systems mapping. And again, just like our living shared systems analysis, the equitable deep decarbonization framework, we understand that this social systems map is a living map. You know, it's constantly being informed, it's constantly changing to reflect where the network's at right now. One of the things that I wanted to point out here, because Christine does not do a good job of bragging about herself, but none of this would be possible without her tool. And this tool, sumApp, is what is just, it has really been transformational for us because it is the only way that I have been able to find to help us get a better understanding of the strength of relationships between people. And it's really easy for our members to use. So it's a lot easier for us to get members to come in here and use this. This is just a screenshot of one of the places where we're asking people to tell us about their connections. So members can come in here, they can tell us about the strength of their relationship, being from, you know, they want to be introduced to this person, or maybe they've talked to them, to that they've intentionally collaborated with them or partnered with them with mutual accountability. And that's the test that we're using, at least, to show that strength of relationship over time. And so I really wanted to make a plug for that before I go on further about our map. So let's go to our beta map here. There we go, great. So again, like, you know, we've just begun the journey working with Christine to start developing this map. What we have started to do is we started aggregating information that we have already. So, you know, we have information, we have some demographic information, we have some participation information, we do have some information and resource allocation because we do regranting as part of our network. We're an intermediary funder. And so we have started testing this out and started piloting it through the network and really inviting small segments of our members to participate. And we often try to incorporate this in places where we would already be engaging members. So things like an orientation or an in-person meeting or around a training or something like that. So right now we have about a quarter of our network individuals on the map, and we're going to be continuing to build this out. But I want to talk about a few ways of how we've already, like, again, even though we're in our early stages, this has already been really, really useful. First and foremost, showing this map, especially during an orientation, just gets people to realize the power of the network. You know, one of the pieces of advice that have stuck with me is that humans are visual first and verbal second, and I've really found that to be true. Before we had the map, when I would do an orientation, you know, we're often trying to find ways to connect people, especially new people in the network. And a lot of times they would just kind of be like, yeah, you know, I'm not really sure what I need or want right now. But as soon as I started showing this map during an orientation, people's eyes just like lit up, and it was like an aha moment. It's like, oh, this is what the network is about. And they start asking a lot of questions, you know, like, hey, actually, you know what? I'm working on utility scale solar, and I want to know who else in this region is working on that. I want to get connected to those people. And that's what's great about this map, is that we're able to do this. Well, we don't know exactly about utility scale solar. We do know about who's working on decarbonizing the power sector. And we also know who's working with businesses or utilities. And so I'm able to do this in real time during an orientation. We can zoom in and start to look at the map together and see who they know or who they don't know, and start making those connections for them and really starting to ramp up their engagement in the network, hopefully to reduce that 2-year learning curve that I had mentioned before. We also use this map to do a lot of recruitment for meetings. You know, we really care about diversity in our network and a diversity of perspectives. So a lot of times, you know, we'll have an in-person meeting coming up, and we want to make sure that, you know, all perspectives are being are there at the table with us. So depending on where we're at in terms of registration or recruitment, we can start to use the map to go find some of those things. A lot of times, we don't have a lot of people in the room that are working on electrifying transportation or changing current transportation options. So we can start to use the map to filter for those characteristics and find those people and start to recruit them. And again, really kind of ensuring that we have a diversity of perspectives in the room. Something else that we do too in terms of our, I think this is part of our network practice in general, is that we're always trying to get people to fly to the center. So as we're looking at this map, it's great because it shows us who's on the edges or who's not as well connected. And that can help us as network staff then be more intentional about that outreach, about that recruitment, and really trying to get people to fly to the center. You know, another thing too that we've really used this for is, you know, we have used some of the social network analysis to help us recruit and identify leaders in our network. One of the my favorite pieces of analysis that we do is this reach efficacy. And when we looked at this, we actually found somebody who was living here, you know, that wasn't really core to the network, but had a lot of reach around the network. And we recruited them to run for our steering committee. You know, once we saw their name on the list, everybody was like, oh, of course, like, why isn't that person sitting on our board? And I think too, the other thing, again, like in a more basic way, our members just really like using this map to finding the people that they're looking for. So in the example I gave, you know, like looking for those utility scale solar people, or looking for people who are working in Minnesota, you know, and maybe it's even a little bit deeper than that. I want to know who's working with rural communities in Minnesota. And again, we're just able to use this map, do that filtering, see what the relationships are like already. And then again, like using that information and reflecting, we can then make smarter connections for people in the network. So that's just how we started using it so far, but we definitely have some deeper aspirations. And here too, I think the audience of your network really matters. So again, like for a new member, right, they're just looking to start connecting, they're just starting their journey. But for somebody like our steering committee, for example, like they're really interested in different dimensions of the network, right? They're interested in where the money is going or how diverse the network is, you know, who's at the core, who's at the edges. And so we're really thinking about how we might start producing different views of the map to help us think more strategically about that. I will say that, you know, this has definitely been a very deep learning journey for us. And I did want to share a few of the challenges that I've experienced so far, because I think it's really important to talk about that. You know, one of the things that Christine mentioned that is definitely a need for us is to develop the capacity of people to read and use the maps. You know, this is a new type of visual language for them. You know, so we're really trying to think about ways to help build the capacity of our members to do that, to feel comfortable using it, to understand it when they look at it. And somewhat related to that too, what I've noticed in the network is when people see the map, like they're instantly inspired and they're really excited, but they have a little bit harder time kind of taking that inspiration and really clarifying it into a vision that we could work towards. So it's something that we're really trying to work with our members to do when they do have that inspiration, like how can we help them think through that a little bit deeper and how it might help them in their work or in their community or in their state. One of the other challenges, and this goes back to my appreciation for the tool that Christine has built, is data management is really, really hard. We've actually tried to use Kumu before we were connected to Christine and sumApp, and we got so frustrated with trying to manage that data in a way that Kumu could understand it that we gave up, and we waited till we were connected to Christine and others to find a better way for us to do that. So, we really appreciate the work that Christine and Tim are doing. And in fact, a lot of what you're seeing in our map too is the result of some of the data wrangling that Christine and Tim do for us to help bring all of those pieces of information together to produce these maps. Something else too is using this map and going to it is a habit. And habits, that requires just practice in order to build that muscle. And sometimes when we go to look at this map, it's really about kind of confirming some of the intuitions or some of what we know already. And sometimes it's not. And as what I've noticed as we've built the habit of going to the map more, it has opened up more possibilities. Like it has engaged people to be more curious, to be more reflective about the network as a whole and not just some part of it. Again, we only have about a quarter of our network individuals on the map so far, so we have some work to onboard and bring on all the other individuals in the network. And you may have noticed too, the data is only as good as the data is. So if somebody decides not to go in and add their information into sumApp, well, it's hard for us to produce, show their value on the map, to show all their connections, to show all their relationships if they're not willing to go and put in the work. So there's some work there to, again, build that capacity and understanding and appreciation so that members are really using the tool as well as they could. I think the other challenge that we've had too is, I had mentioned that we have this, you can see here the relationships between people is really determined by this connection question that tells us about the level of trust between people. And quite frankly, we aren't completely satisfied that these are the right questions to be asking to really get our arms wrapped around that level of trust that we're producing. So it's good enough for now, but it's one of the things that we're definitely thinking a little bit more deeply about. And I think that's probably all I'll have to say for right now. I know that we're going to have time for discussion, so I definitely want to leave space for that.
Well, thank you very much. That was really, really wonderful. And I just want to offer a sort of a question to you and as well as Michael and Christine. And really, it's regarding the blue marble question. What do you three, as you understand the sort of the expression of blue marble evaluation and the potential for it, what are some of the ways that you collectively think that this could be applied to further develop community of practice, but also to further implement towards the principles of blue marble evaluation?
Well, perhaps I should start off, Glenn. This is Michael. The kind of interconnections that Sarah was describing and Christine set the context for is precisely what we're looking to create with a blue marble network, so that it is not just tracking who's on the network or what their connections are, but part of it is as an intervention where as people obtain information from the network, exchange information, and we see where there are opportunities and gaps, that the systems mapping becomes both an evaluation tool, but also an intervention framework that lets people learn in the ways that Sarah talked about. Lets them see who is doing things, helps people find each other and make connections. Especially, I'm hopeful that the network might actually be a way for people to share substantive information. A lot of what we currently share in evaluation networks is about methods and about evaluation, but not about the actual findings and substance of what we're doing. This kind of network allows both to occur. So that it's people connections, but it's also knowledge and information connections, organizational connections, and that we can operate at those multiple levels to help people engage around global transformation. I'll stop with that.
Excellent, excellent. Any thoughts, Christine or Sarah?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I think that was like a perfect setup for me, Michael. I was jotting down some notes as you were talking because I was definitely inspired. And I think in terms of evaluation, this mapping has a lot of potential for us. You know, one of the challenges of the network is, you know, it's not like REAMP, you know, reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the Midwest. It was actually our members who did that. So that ripple effect, that indirect effect of the network is something that's really important in telling the story of the power of it. It's also hard for us to see, right? And we believe that through the social systems mapping, we can start to see some of those ripple effects that come out of the network. The other thing too is, and actually I'll do a quick screen share here again. You know, I think in traditional mapping, at least how I had experienced it, people often want to go here because they're looking for some like right answer. But it's not really about that, right? It's about changing the way that people work together. One of the things that we did is we had a systems thinking academy. And we used the map as an evaluation tool because part of our goal for that academy was to build relationships between people. So before the academy started, we had asked people to go in and tell us about their relationship to other participants. And at the end, we asked them to do the same thing so we could see the change over time. The other thing that I think is really powerful about this map too is it's not just about like, oh, I'm looking at like the academy, like that's the thing that I was most interested in. But we can also see the relationships in parts as they relate to the whole. And that like inspires us to be more curious then too, right? Oh, like look at these relationships that are happening here in Iowa. Like, you know, what's going on there that we might learn from or that we might be able to extrapolate from and learn, you know, and apply to other parts of the network. So it really helps us be more curious and then thinking about how we can really turn that into something that we're learning from, right? It's like a learning tool, as you were saying too, Michael.
Fantastic. And Christine, anything you'd like to add to that from a Blue Marble perspective?
I think the one thing that I keep running into or noticing is the tools that exist, most other kinds of tools by necessity narrow down and focus on simplify things. They try to, you know, like so that we can understand it or so that we can have a conversation about it, it has to be simplified and boiled down to a few key points, which is absolutely important. But what I run into all the time is that when people are faced with a lot of data, different kinds of data, they get overwhelmed and their brains sort of freeze up and they get scared, or they get sort of repulsed. They sort of say, oh, that's just too complicated. And so to me, one of the things I've been realizing is part of the point of the maps, or part of the effect of the maps at least, is to help people sort of relax. Okay, there's a lot going on here, but now let me think about what it is I'm trying to accomplish and what in here, how can I then filter it down in a way that is meaningful for me, but without requiring the whole field to have started out being simple, which in my mind helps us recognize complexity and recognize, you know, be able to navigate that a little, you know, like, and sort of begin to think our way through it as opposed to just sort of run away from it or shut it out. Which, if we want to, you know, from a Blue Marble perspective, it seems like it's that sort of necessary capacity to see through the chaos writ large is what you're talking about. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I'm changing the subject. So I wanted to add one thing, but go ahead.
No, please. Go ahead. Add what you like.
I just wanted to say there's a person in the audience who also has a social system map who sent me a very lovely email yesterday about an experience that she had with her social system map, and I wanted to see if she was willing to give us a minute report back on what she told me in her email. So. And you probably know who you are, so if you're interested, let us know.
Well, then we'll open it up to the floor in just a minute. The last question I want to pose to you three is really the question, it's probably both to you, Sarah and Christine, is the cost and competency dimension. So generally, because this is such an attractive and interesting, but also highly customized approach, and it's one that does require careful interaction. So what would you say as people who are thinking about this and they're saying, my gosh, we've got to have this. What sort of advice would you say when they start thinking about both the costs that they need to be thinking about and the competencies and capacities and commitment they would need to really do something like this?
That's a really good question. And okay, in terms of cost and competency, it can be, and I'm getting more and more convinced that it ought to be a starting where you have the skill, starting meeting people where they are, starting where they're at, and then growing it gradually over time. There are contexts within which Tim and I have to jump in and make a very complex map with a lot of things going on for a client, and do things beyond what sumApp is capable of doing right now, things that we would like to build into sumApp so that other people can be capable of it. But in an ideal world, you would start small and simple and grow from there. And so it was Katie Mammon who I was referring to. Katie has just started from the beginning at the sort of bare minimum of cost, and has a lot of skill in facilitating, but just some skill in terms of the actual tools. And she's done just fine with, I don't know, an account that's roughly $500 a year and a Kumu account that's less than that. So you can get started from the technical perspective for under $1,000 a year. The skill sets and the process to both technically go beyond the tools right now is cost. Then you, like Sarah has hired us to do a lot of complex work. It's not necessarily the place to start. And then there's just who's doing the facilitating, who's doing the actual sense-making work. And that, for instance, Katie could speak to, I mean, there's some of that I think is a labor of love, and some of it is getting paid. And so there's that. But what I'm trying to say is it can be very simple and small budget to very complex and monster size budget, just depending on, not monster size, but big. Depending on how deep you want to jump in. I think and what I'm seeing and saying is that starting from the beginning and letting it emerge gradually, I think is you'll get the most value out of your map from everybody. I don't know if that answered it, Clark.
Oh, very much, very much. Katie, would you like to join in and present some of your results?
Well, hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm happy to just share a little bit off the cuff. I just finished a social system mapping project, which is a little bit different in that it wasn't mapping a network, but really attempting to map a field of actors working in a particular county around a set of issues, specifically water. So we were looking at, well, who's out there working on water resilience and justice, and how are they all connected? Because there were some intuitions that the field wasn't necessarily well connected in a way that allowed it to be as effective as it could be. So again, rather than mapping a specific network, we built some lists based on some other lists that people were holding. And we also did a bunch of outreach to encourage people to join in the map if they self-identified as working on water issues. And we ended up developing a pretty interesting picture of about 140 leaders working on water in this particular county. And I think what Christine, you were referring to earlier is my comment about one of the layers, which was, we'd ask people about their ethnic or racial identification. And then when we mapped that, or took a look at that in Kumu, it was pretty striking because African American and indigenous leaders in the system were very few and were very much on the periphery. And it was just so striking. And, you know, I think a lot of people working in that field could have assumed that or knew that, but having that data, you know, so starkly presented was pretty remarkable. And so it actually enabled, we used some of the snapshots from the map in a convening, and it allowed some new kind of conversations to happen, right? And I think in that one in particular, it kind of legitimized that fact in a way that allowed the conversation about it to go deeper, and for some new strategies to emerge to build you know, racial equity in the field of leadership, and how network weaving could serve that specifically.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Anyone else? Any other questions or thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I've got a question for all of you, but probably you, mostly you, Christine. Just a very basic question. Do you, when you make the maps, see what you're mapping as you're mapping a real entity in the real world out there? Is the social system a real entity in the world out there? Or is it simply a map of the order you are imposing with your mind on a complex world?
Well, clearly it's not real, and it's just a symbolic visual representation. So I don't think anybody thinks of it as real, but I think that that is sort of the purpose of having it be very inclusive and very much designed by the network itself, because it's then more meaningful and closer to real if it reflects what the people in the network care about, or in the field, as Katie said, what aspects of reality that they would like to have a representation of and like to be able to understand better in a context that it's very hard to understand it in a non-visual context. So there's no way to, I mean, it is not possible to represent everything that would be relevant or everything that anybody could think is interesting. I mean, it's really hard even, I mean, it's just the limits that we have already are really hard to deal with data-wise, but and so it's like, this is what I'm saying is the sort of the learning journey is part of the whole purpose, is to have those discussions of, let's say we care about water in this county, and we understand that we can't, none of us can fix it by ourselves. Then what do we need to understand about what's beyond what I already know, and what's beyond what my perspective tells me, and then develop it from there. So it's really a tool for asking that question, and then answering that question, and then asking another question, and then asking another question, and trying to find ways of discovering some information. The question can never be answered, but also it's what can we discover, what can we find out, what can we learn from what is discoverable at the moment, and then take it to the next step. So it's sort of adaptive action, just on and on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, or was there more you were trying to get?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Any other, either the chat box or just unmute and go ahead and pose a question or a thought or comment? Are people finding this useful? Well, I, for one, have been finding this very useful. As you know, Christine, I'm very, very eager to use this, not just in thinking about the evolution and the development of the Blue Marble Network, but also we do a lot of place-based work in at a sort of binational area in the Gulf of Maine, at the boundary of Canada and U.S. And is there any issue? Are there any issues regarding binational data gathering that one needs to pay attention to if you're working transboundary?
Well, obviously there's the GDPR in Europe. That's the only one I'm aware of. And a number of our customers are doing transnational boundary data gathering.
How about network to network? Let's say that there is a network that's done great investment and has a good sort of regional focus, and another network that's been developed other part of the world that has a very strong regional focus, and the two want to connect. Is there a way to do that?
Not directly in the tool at the moment, because each data set is gathered by some identifiable entity, and the people who give their data to that identifiable entity didn't give it to some other identifiable entity on the other side of the world. So there's sort of data privacy, data management issues there I mean, that's definitely a capacity, like a need that we understand that people do need to be able to, networks around the globe do need to be able to find each other and connect across different networks and across countries. So thinking through how could that be made possible is definitely, on our list of things to work on. But it will be more than simply a technical challenge. It will also be a data management in terms of privacy and permissions challenge.
Yeah,
well.
Excellent. So there's some comments in the chat box. One from Ashley Bishop saying, very helpful, thanks. I was very interested to hear about bringing together social networks with other systems and trying to understand each with the other's influence.
So that,
So are you, I've put the SDGs up. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Let me bring this back to some of the global issues. The issue of networks, and part of what we'll be getting into in the theory of transformation. So, and Christine and I have talked about this, and she's done some mapping, exploratory work of one of the blue marble principles is trying to connect across silos, and the silos are both issues, but they're the people within those silos. And so if you take any particular way of grouping the silos, one of the most widely used is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, where they combined those SDGs that had to do with the economy, those that had to do with society, those that had to do with the biosphere, and see it as a kind of wedding cake structure. And so each of those are subnetworks within the larger SDG universe, where you can take any particular SDG and look at how other SDGs are related to it. So if you put hunger in the middle, you see the ways in which other SDGs relate to zero hunger. And what this gets at from a blue marble evaluation perspective is that we're mapping both issue areas and looking at the connections, breaking down the silos within which the SDGs operate, but the people and the organizations within those various SDG arenas. And seeing the connections then among SDGs and among the people. And that's what we'll be getting into when we get into the theory of transformation. This is another form of visual, and any kind of systems mapping, as both Sarah and Christine talked about, the power of the visuals. This is a visual map of the different kinds of security issues that people in India face, and it shows the various non-governmental organizations, programs, and projects that are working on different aspects of security in India. Personal security, economic security, community security, environmental security, education security, food security, political security, health security, the ways in which for an individual family, these various forms of security come together. And so when we're looking at interconnecting SDGs, interconnecting various issues, and the people within those, we're really looking at global systems as the thing to be evaluated. And that then includes mapping the connections between organizations, issues, people, and networks. That would be the ideal that we would be heading for. And Christine and I have been working on a proposal that would help pilot that very kind of of approach.
If I could take a minute, I want to just show you an example that Sarah didn't share on her map. This is an example. Yeah, hang on a second. So here's another way of this. Here's one beginning way of looking at that, which is this is Saras Network map, and these the squares are sort of equivalent to the SDGs. In this context, they're the focus of the systemic analysis that Sarah and her colleagues did in the REAMP network about the sort of the leverage points in the system that they're trying to shift. And so we can see in this view the elements or the goals and who's related to the goals. So we can start to see where, you know, some people are working on 2 goals, this person's working on 4 goals or 5 goals, and start to see the overlap between the people working on the goals themselves. And then we also have their organizations. They're not hooked up to the goals yet, but the organizations within Saras Network are also a layer that we're working on. And then so it starts to do that sort of that last view that Michael had, or the second to last view, with all the strings all over the place, in a way that is not static, and that is just want to enables you to filter down. And sometimes it takes a while, and I'm trying to get this side panel to close, in a way that is both shows the whole, you know, like all of the things that you have put in the layer, but also you can start to filter into, oh, there was another view we just did. Did we do, Sarah, did we do the, oh, that's this one. So now we've got, this is another version of the organizational view where we're coloring and sizing based on staff and budget. So we can start to see where what are the capacities of the organizations, and where there may be organizations that could use more support, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of ways as you're building it, you're starting to think of not only what's the whole big mass, but how can we begin to engage it in ways that tell us more. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing that strikes me is, are you able to georeference anything? Obviously, GIS is an important field, and it's parallel to information, but it's referenced to geographic location. Has there been a way to align any of this mapping with geographic referencing?
Well, so there's one thing we do commonly is ask about geography, and then that's just a filter, like when Sarah was showing you in her map when she filtered on the states. So that's right. A really not representational, but a way of using geo filtering. In terms of representationally, Kumu does allow for geo mapping. The interface is not as great as we'd like. Everybody in everybody in Minneapolis would be piled on top of each other. So there might be 100 people, but you'd see, you know, just one big blob. But when you have a more distributed network, geomapping in Kumu can be useful. And then we do have people, like we have customers who will just take their data and plug it into a geomap and then link to it through the Kumu side panel. So it's doable. It's not perfect, but it's, yeah. But at least, you know, to the degree that, you know, if you're talking about a global network and you want to find who's working in Southeast Asia, we absolutely can find that. That's absolutely discoverable with the current setup. It's the current technology. It's just that you won't be able to see it geographically on a globe as well as you might like.
Yeah, gotcha. And Sarah, let's turn it over to you. There's been a nice chat that you've been working with a few folks. Any sort of summary thoughts on the questions, answers in the chat that's been going on?
No, I mean, the question from Katie was just wondering about like some ahas, right? As you kind of go through this process, right? You learn along the way. The question of trust is something that we've really been wrestling with. I mentioned that in my presentation. But, as we've talked about that among staff especially, it's sort of like, to what end is that connection question for, right? Is it about telling the story of the network, or is it about like helping me, do my job better, or to think about how to like connect or improve the network in a different way? And the other thing too, as Christine was showing the map of our organizations, it got me thinking too, another question that we've had that we've been wondering about is like, is it useful to track the relationships between organizations in addition to people? We have not, we're not thinking about doing that quite yet, but it's definitely one of those questions that has popped up as we've been learning along the way.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all so much. And Michael, let's turn it over to you to close out, and any final announcements for the upcoming webinars.
Thank you, Christine and Sarah. Very, very helpful. It'd be important to our work going forward. Are we the same time next Monday, Glenn? Do you know?
Let's see. Next Monday, yes, same time as today.
Okay. And that will be the beginning of a series on theory of transformation and Blue Marble evaluation. Next Monday is Earth Day, so we'll be kicking it off with that commemoration. And thanks, Glenn and Charmaine, for organizing the infrastructure, Christine and Sarah for presenting, all of you for being a part of this. This will be available as a recording, and we will look forward to reconnecting with you in future webinars.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for showing up.
Thank you.
And thank you, Christine, so much for leading this. And Sarah, it was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie, for talking. No, she's going.
Yes.